The air in that corner of Georgia in 1842 was not air at all, but a thick, wet blanket woven from river water, pine rot, and the sweet, cloying decay of magnolias. It was a tangible presence, something that settled in the lungs and refused to leave, much like the stories that festered there. One such story concerns a man named Silas, who owned a stretch of land that bled into the murky waters of the Oconee River, and another man named Obadiah, who belonged to him. The land itself was unremarkable, but its heart was a grist mill, and the heart of the mill was the sluice, a dark channel that held the river's terrible power in its grip. That power, one humid night, would be turned to a purpose for which it was never designed. If you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, where the official records fall silent and only whispers remain, and this is your first time in our archives, then consider subscribing. Join us as we piece together the fragments of stories that were never meant to survive, ensuring their echoes are not lost to the dust. The plantation was less a curated estate and more a wound carved into the dense Georgia wilderness. Its boundaries were defined not by fences of white oak and cypress, but by the natural cruelties of the landscape. To the north, a near impenetrable cypress swamp, its black water still and watchful, exhaling a perpetual mist that clung to the knees of the live oaks. To the east and west, vast tracts of longleaf pine, their serried ranks so dense that the midday sun was reduced to a scattering of pale coins on a floor of needles and shed bark. And to the south, there was the river, the Oconee. It was not a gentle river, not in that place. It was wide and sullen, its currents deceptive, its surface the color of tarnished pewter. It gnawed at the red clay of its banks, carrying away soil and memory with equal indifference, a slow and perpetual act of theft. The river was the plantation's lifeblood and its eventual shroud, the source of its power and the vessel for its darkest secret. It was the final, uncrossable line. Set near a sharp, aggressive bend in the river was the mill. It was the plantation's singular monument, the only structure built with any sense of permanence. While the great house was a sprawling but ultimately flimsy affair of whitewashed clapboard, already surrendering to the humidity, the mill was a brute. Its foundation was river stone, slick with green algae and dark with age, ascending into walls of massive, hand-hewn timbers that had long ago lost their original color, weathering to a shade of gray that was almost indistinguishable from the perpetual overcast sky. The roof was slate, chipped, and fractured in places, allowing thin, intrusive fingers of daylight to pierce the gloom within. The entire edifice leaned, just slightly, toward the water, as if in a constant state of supplication or threat. It was a place of work, of relentless, grinding labor that turned corn to meal and wheat to flour, but no one ever spoke of it as such. They called it the grinder or the wheelhouse, but mostly they spoke of it in terms of its sound. The sound was the plantation's true master. It was a low, guttural groan that began before sunrise and did not cease until well after dusk. It was the protest of the massive water wheel, a colossal wooden skeleton some 16 feet in diameter, as it fought against the river's push. The sound traveled, seeping into the soil, vibrating up through the floorboards of the slave cabins and the great house alike. It was a constant, oppressive reminder of the plantation's engine, a relentless, grinding metronome that set the pace for every life within its domain. The wheel turned a series of gears and shafts inside the mill, a complex and poorly understood anatomy of wood and iron that ultimately spun the massive granite millstones. The sound of the stones themselves was different, a high, scraping shriek that could be heard over the groan of the wheel. It was the sound of rock eating rock, of inedible things being crushed into sustenance. For the enslaved, It was the sound of their own lives being ground down, day by agonizing day. And at the center of this mechanism of noise and power was the sluice. It was a man-made channel, a deep, narrow gorge lined with moss-slick timbers that diverted a portion of the river's current directly toward the water wheel. The flow was controlled by a gate, a heavy plank of waterlogged oak that could be raised or lowered by a large spoked winch. When the gate was closed, the diverted water would pool behind it, becoming still and black, a mirror for the oppressive sky. When the winch was turned and the gate lifted, the water would surge forward with a deafening roar, a sudden and shocking violence that struck the paddles of the great wheel and set the entire monstrous process in motion. The sluice was a choke point, a place where the full, untamed force of the Oconee River was harnessed and bent to one man's will. It was the physical manifestation of control, a constant demonstration of power over a force of nature. And it was here, in this place of controlled violence, that the enslaved man, Obadiah, would often stand, his eyes not on the great wheel, but on the churning, furious water beneath the gate. The master of this place, Silas, was a man carved from the same hard material as his mill. He was not a physically imposing man, being of average height and possessing a frame that was beginning to soften with the indolence his position afforded him. His authority was not derived from his stature, but from a deep and abiding wellspring of cruelty that seemed to be his most natural and defining feature. His face was often flushed, a mottled red that deepened with intake of corn whiskey, and his eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, held a flat, reptilian stillness. They were the eyes of a man who saw the world not as a collection of fellow souls, but as an inventory of assets, tools, and obstacles. His arrogance was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, atmospheric, as pervasive and inescapable as the humidity. It was present in the way he walked, a slow, deliberate gait that forced others to either stop or move around him. It was present in the way he gave orders, his voice rarely rising above a conversational murmur, the quietness itself a threat, implying that to misunderstand or disobey was a failure so profound it did not warrant the energy of a shout. He owned the land, the mill, the great house, and the 53 souls who worked them, but he held a special kind of ownership over the mill. It was his creation, his testament. He had overseen its construction a decade prior, driving the enslaved builders with a relentless ferocity, working them through scorching summers and damp, chilling winters until the monstrous thing was complete. He understood its mechanics intimately, the interplay of gears, the tension of the drive belts, the precise amount the sluice gate needed to be opened to achieve the most efficient grind. He would often spend hours there, not working, but observing, a silent sentinel amidst the deafening noise. He would watch the whole process, from the sacks of corn being hauled up to the top floor to the fine, pale meal pouring from the chute, and a look of profound satisfaction would settle on his features. It was the look of a god contemplating his own perfect, brutal creation. This satisfaction was, for Silas, a form of nourishment. He fed on the power the mill represented, on the transformation of raw material into profit through the application of harnessed natural force and compelled human labor. The enslaved community lived in a state of quiet, managed terror. Silas did not need to resort to the whip as often as some masters in the county. His cruelty was more inventive, more psychological. He understood that the threat of violence was often more effective than the act itself. He cultivated an atmosphere of uncertainty, where a dropped tool, a slow response, or a perceived insolent glance could result in a punishment of baroque and terrifying creativity. He was a master of humiliation, of stripping away a person's dignity in front of their family and peers, leaving a wound that no salve could ever heal. His presence was a constant, low-grade fever that afflicted the plantation, and everyone knew that the fever could spike at any moment, without warning, without reason. This was the source of his arrogance, the absolute certainty that he was the sun around which all other bodies in his small universe were forced to orbit, and that he could scorch any one of them at will. Among those bodies was a man named Obadiah. Obadiah was tall and powerfully built, his physique a product of years of hard labor, from clearing fields to hauling stones for the mill's foundation. He had been born on the plantation, as had his mother before him. He knew no other world. His face was a mask of stoic endurance, his eyes holding a depth that betrayed nothing of his thoughts. He moved with the same deliberate economy as his master, but where Silas's movements were born of arrogance, Obadiah's were born of conservation. He wasted no energy, no motion, no words. He was known for his silence, a silence so profound it was often unsettling to the other enslaved people. While others might find solace in whispered conversations after dark, in shared grievances or remembered joys, Obadiah remained apart, a solitary figure observing the world from behind a wall of quiet intensity. His hands, calloused and scarred, were rarely still. He would often be seen mending a tool or weaving a basket, his focus absolute, his movements precise and practiced. He had a wife, Ilara, whose spirit had not yet been entirely ground down by the place. It was for her, and the memory of his mother, that Obadiah maintained his careful facade. He had once, many years before, owned a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a gift from his mother just before she succumbed to fever. It was his only possession, his only link to a time before the suffocating weight of his existence became his entire reality. One afternoon, Silas had seen him holding it, turning it over in his hands during a brief rest from his work. Without a word, Silas had taken the bird, examined it with a look of mild curiosity, and then tossed it into the churning water of the mill race, where it was instantly devoured and splintered by the great wheel. He had then turned and walked away, never acknowledging the act, leaving Obadiah to stare at the spot where his only meaningful object had ceased to exist. Obadiah's face had not changed. He had not cried out, had not even flinched. He simply watched the water for a long moment, then picked up his tool and returned to work. The other slaves who witnessed the small, casual act of destruction saw nothing in his expression. But in that moment, something inside him had shifted, had settled into a new and permanent shape, as hard and as unyielding as the granite millstones. The first hints of his resistance were imperceptible to anyone but himself. They were not grand gestures of defiance, but small, internal acts of reclamation. When Silas gave an order, Obadiah would hold his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, a silent refusal to be the first to look away. It was a minuscule thing, a risk that could earn him a beating, but it was his. When working in the fields under the brutal sun, he would regulate his own breathing, finding a rhythm that was his own, not one dictated by the overseer's calls. He was creating a space inside himself that Silas could not touch, a small, fortified territory of the soul. He began to study the plantation not as a prisoner studying his cell, but as a predator studying its hunting ground. He noted the way the overseers made their rounds, the times when Silas was deepest in his cups, the loose board on the bridge over the creek. His attention, however, was most often drawn to the mill. He started volunteering for the most grueling jobs there, hauling the heavy sacks of corn up the steep, narrow stairs, sweeping the fine, powdery meal that coated every surface, even offering to assist in the dangerous work of clearing jams in the machinery. The other slaves thought him a fool for inviting such labor, for placing himself so close to the master's seat of power. They did not understand that Obadiah was not seeking labor. He was seeking knowledge. He was learning the mill's rhythms, its weaknesses, its language of groans and shrieks. He spent his breaks not in the shade, but near the sluice, watching. He studied the winch that operated the gate, noting the amount of force required to turn it, the way the locking pin seated in the gear. He studied the current, the way the water boiled and churned when the gate was opened, the sheer, unstoppable force of it. He would stare into the turbulent water for long stretches, his face impassive, his mind a quiet, focused engine of calculation. The grinding of the millstones became the soundtrack to his thoughts, the relentless noise a cover for the silent, meticulous construction of a plan. He was not just observing a machine, he was learning a weapon, and in the deep, unreadable silence of his gaze, a terrible resolve was beginning to harden. The core question was not what would drive a man to risk his life by defying his master. The question had already been answered. The only question that remained was when. The cruelty of Silas was a slow poison, administered in small, steady doses, that had long ago saturated the soil and the souls of his plantation. It existed in a realm without witness, or rather, without the kind of witness whose word carried weight beyond the cypress swamp. The law, the church, the society of his peers in the nearby town of Milledgeville. They were all structures built on a foundation that rendered the suffering of the enslaved invisible, a private matter of property management. The only true witnesses were the 53 men, women, and children who belonged to him, and their testimony was a silent one, recorded not in ledgers or court documents, but in the intricate tracery of scars on their backs and the deep, permanent watchfulness in their eyes. They were a captive audience to a theater of brutality, where the master was the sole playwright and protagonist, and the script was written anew each day in sweat and fear. The instruments of this cruelty were not always the bullwhip or the branding iron. Silas had two overseers, men named Phineas and Theron, who acted as extensions of his will, his hands and his voice in the far-flung corners of the fields. Phineas was a thick, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice that he used as a blunt instrument, a cudgel of sound to batter the enslaved into submission. His violence was simple, direct, and predictable. Theron, conversely, was a thin, sallow man who rarely spoke. He moved with a reptilian quietness, his presence often unknown until his shadow fell across you. His cruelty was more refined, a thing of whispers and carefully chosen moments of psychological torment. He was the one who would report a mother's lullaby as a sign of insurrection, or a husband's protective glance as insolence. Phineas broke bodies, but Theron aimed to break the spirit. Together, they formed a pincer of dread that closed around the enslaved from sunrise to sunset. One sweltering afternoon in late summer, a season when the air itself felt like a physical weight, Silas chose to make an example of an elderly man named Josiah. Josiah was the plantation's cooper, a man whose skill with oak and iron was so profound that even Silas acknowledged it, albeit grudgingly. He was respected by the enslaved community, a quiet patriarch who held the memory of generations in his steady, knowing gaze. His crime was an act of simple compassion. He had given a portion of his own meager water ration to a young woman who had collapsed from heat and exhaustion in the cotton fields. Theron had observed this, his thin lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The act was reported not as kindness, but as theft of the master's time and a disruption of labor. The punishment was not a whipping. That would have been too straightforward, too mercifully brief. Instead, Silas had Josiah brought to the open space between the great house and the slave cabins, a dusty, sun-baked patch of ground that served as his stage. He ordered Josiah to stand atop an empty hogshead barrel. For 3 days, from the moment the sun cleared the pines to the moment it bled into the horizon, Josiah was made to stand there. He was denied food and given only enough water to prevent his death. The barrel was unsteady, and the effort of remaining upright on its slightly convex surface under the relentless sun was an exercise in pure agony. His legs trembled, his back seized, and sweat poured from him, carving pale, clean tracks through the dust that coated his skin. The entire enslaved community was forced to witness this. They worked in the adjacent fields. They walked past him on their way to and from their cabins. They saw his silhouette against the fiery sunsets. Silas would often come out onto the veranda of the great house, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and watch the slow, torturous ordeal with the dispassionate air of a man observing a scientific experiment. He told Phineas, in a voice loud enough for all to hear, that a man who believed himself important enough to disrupt the natural order of things should be elevated so that all could see him. The humiliation was the true punishment. Josiah, the respected elder, was transformed into a public spectacle, a living scarecrow meant to frighten away any notions of solidarity or compassion. Obadiah worked through those 3 days with his usual impassive focus, his movements economical, his face a stone mask. He did not look at Josiah more than anyone else, yet he was aware of every tremor that racked the old man's body, every pained breath he drew. He saw the averted eyes of the others, the way the women would bite their lips until they were white, the way the men's hands would clench into fists around their tools. He saw all of this, and stored it away in that fortified, silent place within him. The rage of the community was a palpable thing, a low, humming vibration in the oppressive air, but it was a rage with no outlet, a force with no vector. It was the roar of a fire in a sealed iron box, growing hotter and more pressurized with every passing hour. It was during this period of heightened, simmering tension that Silas chose to make the mill sluice a more direct instrument of his dominion. The incident involved a boy named Samuel, barely 13 years of age, who worked as a sweeper in the mill. His job was to keep the floors clear of the fine, highly combustible meal powder that was a byproduct of the grinding process. In a moment of youthful carelessness, he had failed to properly sweep an area near the main gearing mechanism, and a small amount of the powder had ignited from a spark thrown by the grinding stones. The flash fire was instantaneous and harmless, extinguishing itself in a puff of smoke, but the overseer, Theron, had been present. Silas did not have the boy whipped. Instead, he dragged him from the mill himself, his fingers clamped around the boy's thin arm, and took him to the sluice gate. The mill was in full operation, the great wheel turning, the water churning violently in the race. Silas ordered Phineas to close the sluice gate. The groan of the wheel slowed, the grinding shriek of the stones died away, and an unsettling quiet fell, punctuated only by the sullen gurgle of the river. He forced Samuel to the edge of the deep, timber-lined channel. He spoke to the boy, his voice calm and instructional, as if he were explaining a principle of mechanics. He said that this place, this channel, was where the power came from. He explained that the river was a wild and stupid thing, but here he had tamed it. He had it in a chokehold. He said that the boy, and everyone like him, was also a wild and stupid thing, and that he, Silas, held them in a similar grip. To illustrate his point, he had Phineas stand at the winch. He told Samuel that he wanted the boy to understand what happened when control was relinquished, even for a moment. Then he gave the signal. Phineas grunted with effort as he threw his weight against the winch handles, releasing the locking pin. The heavy oak gate shot upward. For a split second, there was a terrible silence as the pooled water gathered itself, and then it erupted into the channel with a deafening, explosive roar. It was not a flow, but a solid wall of brown, frothing water that slammed into the boy, who was standing just to the side of its main path. The force threw him from his feet, smashing him against the rough-hewn timbers of the channel wall. The water was a living, bellowing monster, a liquid avalanche that sought to drag him down into the churning chaos of the mill race. Samuel screamed, a thin, terrified sound that was instantly swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the water. Silas watched, his expression unchanged. He let the terror build, let the boy struggle against the current that was trying to pull him under. Then, just as Samuel's grip on a protruding root began to fail, Silas gave another calm signal. Phineas, with great effort, forced the gate back down. The roar of the water subsided, its violent energy cut off at the source, leaving only the sound of the boy's ragged, panicked sobs and the dripping of water from the timbers. Silas walked over to the drenched and shivering boy, who was huddled against the wall of the sluice. He did not offer a hand. He simply looked down at him and told him that power, true power, was the ability to open the gate and to close it. He said he hoped the boy had learned his lesson about the dangers of carelessness. Obadiah was there. He had been hauling sacks of grain nearby and had been ordered to stop and watch the demonstration. He stood perfectly still, his powerful frame a statue of feigned indifference. But his eyes missed nothing. He saw the terror on Samuel's face, the cruel satisfaction in Silas's posture, the brute obedience of Phineas at the winch. More than anything, he felt the roar of the water. It was a physical blow, a vibration that traveled from the soles of his feet up into his chest. In that moment, the sound of the sluice became intertwined with the silent, contained rage inside him. The water's power and his own suppressed fury became one and the same. He looked from the terrified boy to the heavy, waterlogged gate, to the simple iron pin that held it in place. He saw not just a mechanism for controlling water, but a tool, a weapon, an instrument of judgment. The master had meant to teach a lesson about his own inescapable control, but Obadiah had learned a different lesson entirely. He had learned the precise mechanics of his master's death. That night, long after the plantation had sunk into a fitful, exhausted sleep, Obadiah left his cabin. He did not move like a man trying to be stealthy. He simply moved with his usual quiet purpose, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. He walked the path to the mill, a place that was now transformed in his mind. It was no longer just a site of labor and oppression. It was a place of grim potential. The moon was a sliver, casting a weak, skeletal light that seemed only to deepen the shadows. The air was thick and carried the scent of the river and the damp, decaying wood of the mill. The great wheel was still, a dark, skeletal arc against the star-dusted sky. He went to the sluice. The gate was down, the water behind it calm and black, holding a distorted reflection of the moon. He placed his hand on the massive, wet timber of the gate, feeling the immense weight of it, the contained power it held back. He ran his fingers over the winch mechanism, touching the cold iron of the gears and the locking pin. He put his shoulder to one of the handles and pushed. It was immensely heavy, designed for a strong man to operate, but it moved. He didn't lift the gate, he only tested the weight, learned the feel of the mechanism, the point where the resistance was greatest. He was no longer just enduring, he was studying, he was preparing. He stood there for what must have been an hour, in the profound silence of the southern night, the only sound the gentle lapping of the river against its banks. The fury within him was no longer a hot, chaotic fire. It had cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a single, focused point of intent. The man who walked back to the cabins in the pre-dawn gloom was not the same man who had walked out. The long, agonizing period of observation was over. Something inside him had not broken. It had been forged. The decision, once made, did not announce itself with a clap of thunder or a torment of the soul. It arrived as a profound and unsettling calm, a silence that settled in the very center of Obadiah's being. quieting the storm that had raged there for years. The rage was not gone. It had simply been banked, its chaotic energy channeled and focused, like the river itself being forced into the narrow confines of the sluice. His secret resolve was not a plot to be hatched, but a truth to be accepted. He knew, with the certainty of a man watching the sun rise, that he was going to kill Silas. The question of his own survival was a secondary matter, a detail to be considered, but not a deterrent. The act itself had become a necessity, as essential to his continued existence as the drawing of breath. To do nothing was to consent to his own spiritual annihilation, to allow the final embers of his humanity to be ground into dust, just like the corn in the mill. His nights became a time of pilgrimage, while the other enslaved people sought the brief oblivion of sleep, a temporary release from the crushing weight of their lives. Obadiah found a different kind of solace in wakefulness. He would slip from his cabin, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, and make his way to the river. He avoided the paths, moving instead through the tall, wet grass at the edge of the fields, his senses alive to the nocturnal world. The chirr of crickets, the low, mournful call of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, all these sounds were a part of the immense, breathing silence of the night. This was his time, a space he carved out of the darkness where he was not a slave, but simply a man alone with his thoughts and the ancient, brooding presence of the land. His destination was always the same, the mill. It loomed in the faint starlight, a hulking, misshapen beast that seemed even more menacing in its slumber. The constant, grinding groan of its daytime operation was replaced by a different set of sounds. The creak of timbers settling, the drip of water from the motionless wheel, the soft, sighing rush of the main river current flowing past. He would go to the sluice, his sanctuary of grim purpose. The place had become a cathedral to his silent, terrible vow. He would stand on the edge of the channel and watch the water, his constant and powerful accomplice. On nights when the moon was full, its light would transform the surface of the pooled water behind the gate into a sheet of polished silver. It shimmered and danced, the reflection a perfect, fragile image of the heavens above. He would watch the way the moonlight caught the ripples, the way it seemed to penetrate the first few inches of the black water before being swallowed by the depths. The shimmering surface was like a veil, beautiful and deceptive, hiding the immense, cold power that lay just beneath. It was an omen, a confirmation. It mirrored the placid surface he presented to the world, the calm exterior that concealed the depths of his resolve. He felt a kinship with the water, with its deceptive stillness, its capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence. He was learning its nature, and in doing so, he was coming to understand his own. He began to whisper to the river. They were not prayers, not pleas for intervention. They were statements of fact, a private catechism spoken into the uncaring ear of the night. He would stand over the sluice, the smell of wet earth and algae filling his nostrils, and he would say the words aloud, his voice barely a murmur, easily lost in the sound of the crickets. He said that a man was not a tool. He said that a soul was not a piece of property. He said that the bird his mother had carved was not just a piece of wood. He said Silas's name, turning it over on his tongue as if it were a strange and foreign object. Each whispered declaration was an act of forging, hammering his intent into a harder, more resilient shape. He was not asking for justice from some unseen god. He was telling the river, his silent partner, what was going to happen. He was making a promise to the water, the only witness he trusted. His days were now a performance. He worked with the same relentless efficiency, his face the same unreadable mask of endurance. But now, behind the mask, his mind was constantly working, observing, refining his plan. His small, deliberate acts of resistance continued, but now they served a dual purpose. They were not just about reclaiming his own dignity. They were about testing the boundaries of the system that imprisoned him. He would subtly alter the way a harness was buckled on a mule, a change so minor it would go unnoticed by the overseers but would cause the leather to wear unevenly over time. He would accidentally drop a handful of sand into the grease box of a wagon wheel, knowing that the grinding of the grit would slowly, inexorably, wear down the axle. These were tiny, almost insignificant acts of sabotage, grains of sand in the great, brutal machine of the plantation. They were his way of practicing, of learning how to introduce a flaw into a system that seemed perfect and unassailable. He never spoke of his intentions to anyone. To do so would be to invite disaster, to risk not only his own life but the lives of anyone he confided in. His secret was a heavy stone, and he carried it alone. He watched Alara as she moved through her day, her own spirit a flickering candle in the oppressive darkness, and the weight of his secret grew heavier. He knew that his act, whether it succeeded or failed, would shatter the fragile world she inhabited. This knowledge was the source of his only hesitation, the only crack in the hard facade of his resolve. But then he would see Silas look at her, his pale eyes lingering for a moment too long, a look of casual assessment, of ownership, and the hesitation would vanish, burned away by a fresh surge of cold, clarifying hatred. He was not just doing this for himself, or for the memory of his mother, or for the old man Josiah. He was doing this for her, to shatter the cage before the keeper decided to turn his attention to the last songbird within it. The plan itself was brutally simple, relying not on complex machinations but on timing, opportunity, and an intimate understanding of his target. Silas, for all his control, had a significant and predictable weakness: the corn whiskey he consumed in prodigious quantities every evening. After his final meal, he would often walk the grounds of the plantation, a proprietor surveying his domain. His steps, usually so measured and arrogant, would become unsteady, his movements clumsy. He was particularly drawn to the mill, his monument to himself. He would sometimes stand there for a long time in the darkness, staring at its silent form, muttering to himself. This drunken pilgrimage was his routine, his ritual, and it was this ritual that Obadiah planned to interrupt. The final piece of his preparation was a length of rope. He had acquired it piece by piece, short sections of discarded hemp line that he had found near the riverbank, remnants of barge moorings. Over the course of several weeks, he had carefully, meticulously spliced them together, his calloused fingers working with practiced skill in the darkness of his cabin while Alara slept. He braided them into a single, strong length, about 10 feet long. It was not a weapon for strangulation. It was a tool for leverage, for control. He hid it in a hollowed-out log near the mill, a place he had prepared weeks in advance. One evening, as a heavy, ominous stillness settled over the plantation, a stillness that often preceded a summer thunderstorm, Obadiah knew the time had come. There was no specific sign, no celestial event. It was an internal knowledge, a sense that all the tumblers of fate had finally clicked into place. He watched Silas on the veranda of the great house, silhouetted against the warm light of the oil lamps, and saw him drain his third glass of whiskey. He saw the master descend the steps, his form swaying slightly as he began his nightly walk. Obadiah did not follow. He went ahead, melting into the shadows and taking a circuitous route to the mill. He moved with a predatory grace, his senses heightened. He retrieved the rope from its hiding place, coiling it in his left hand. He went to the sluice and stood by the winch, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He was not afraid. The fear had been burned out of him long ago, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of his purpose. He stood in the darkness, a sentinel waiting for a foregone conclusion, and listened. He heard the unsteady footsteps of his master approaching, the crunch of boots on the gravel path. He heard the man's slurred, angry muttering, a one-sided conversation with the ghosts of his own tyranny. The air was thick, pregnant with unspoken violence and the coming rain. The moon was hidden behind a bank of dark, bruised clouds. The stage was set. The accomplice was waiting. The moment of reckoning was finally at hand. The night air was a held breath, thick and electric. The storm that had been threatening all evening had stalled, leaving the world suspended in a state of profound, suffocating stillness. Not a leaf stirred. The only sound was the incessant, sawing drone of insects, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence rather than break it. It was into this charged atmosphere that Silas stumbled, a man navigating the landscape of his own drunkenness. He moved with the graceless, lurching momentum of a felled tree, his path a weaving approximation of the gravel track that led from the great house to the mill. He held a nearly empty bottle of corn whiskey by its neck, swinging it loosely at his side like a censer dispensing the profane sacrament of his own arrogance. He was muttering, a low, continuous stream of grievances directed at the world in general, the ungratefulness of his overseers, the falling price of cotton, the insolence he perceived in the downcast eyes of his slaves. It was the litany of a petty tyrant, convinced of his own omnipotence, yet perpetually aggrieved by the failure of reality to conform perfectly to his will. From the deep shadows near the sluice, Obadiah watched him approach. He was as still as the cypress trees that fringed the swamp, a figure carved from the night itself. The coiled rope in his hand was cool and rough against his palm, a tangible anchor for the cold, unyielding purpose that had now completely filled him. He was no longer a man of thoughts and doubts. He was an instrument, a vessel for an act that had become as inevitable as the coming rain. His heart did not race. His breath was even and slow. He felt a strange and terrible clarity, a sense of seeing the world for the first time as it truly was, a place of brutal mechanics, of force and counterforce. Silas, in his drunken stupor, was simply a force that had, for too long, gone unopposed. Tonight, Obadiah would be the counterforce. Silas reached the mill yard, a wide, open space of packed earth and scattered debris. He stopped and stared up at the dark, hulking silhouette of the mill, his monument. He raised the bottle to his lips, tilted his head back, and drained the last of the whiskey. The gesture was one of triumphant ownership, a toast to himself and his creation. He then threw the empty bottle with a sudden, violent motion. It spun through the air and shattered against the stone foundation of the mill, the sound of breaking glass unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. It was a sound of casual, unthinking destruction, the punctuation mark on his drunken monologue. He laughed, a short, ugly bark that held no humor, only contempt. He then turned and, as if drawn by some morbid instinct, began to walk toward the sluice, the place where he had so recently demonstrated the nature of his power. This was the moment. Obadiah did not rush. He did not spring from the shadows. He simply stepped out into the faint, ambient light, placing himself directly in Silas's path. He moved with a quiet deliberation that was far more terrifying than any sudden assault. For a moment, Silas did not seem to recognize him. His alcohol-clouded brain struggled to process the unexpected appearance of a slave in this place. At this hour, he saw only a tall, dark obstacle, a disruption in his solitary ritual. He squinted, his head weaving slightly, and asked what in God's name he was doing there. His voice was thick with whiskey and irritation. Obadiah did not answer with words. He answered by uncoiling the rope. The sight of the rope seemed to pierce through the fog of Silas's intoxication. His eyes widened, a flicker of confusion giving way to a dawning, incredulous rage. The idea that this man, his property, would dare to confront him, to stand before him with a rope in his hand, was a violation of the fundamental laws of his universe. It was an absurdity, an impossibility. He sputtered, taking a half step back, his hand instinctively going to his hip where a pistol would normally be holstered, but he was unarmed. He told Obadiah to drop the rope, his voice a mixture of command and disbelief. He called him by his name, but the name came out as a slur, a venomous hiss. Obadiah took another slow step forward. The space between them shrank. In that instant, the last vestiges of Silas's drunken arrogance evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He saw the look in Obadiah's eyes. It was not the look of a rebellious slave. It was something far older, far more elemental. It was the flat, dispassionate gaze of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. The master and slave dynamic, the entire social structure that had defined their lives, dissolved in that terrible moment, leaving only two men in the darkness, one armed with a lifetime of contained fury, the other with nothing but the rapidly fading authority of his own name. Silas turned to run, his drunken legs tangling beneath him. He was clumsy, slow, his movements thick with panic. Obadiah was neither. He lunged forward, closing the remaining distance in two powerful strides. He did not aim for the man's head or throat. He threw the rope, not as a lasso, but as a weighted line. It snaked through the air and wrapped around Silas's ankles. Obadiah pulled back with a sharp, brutal jerk. Silas's feet were ripped out from under him. He fell hard, his chin striking the packed earth with a sickening thud. The air rushed from his lungs in a pained gasp. Before he could recover, before he could even process the fall, Obadiah was upon him. There was no theatrical struggle, no prolonged fight. Obadiah was a creature of pure, focused efficiency. He pinned Silas to the ground with his knee, the weight of his body driving the air from the master's chest. Silas thrashed, his hands clawing at the dirt, his face a mask of terrified shock. He tried to scream, but the pressure on his back made it impossible to draw a full breath. Obadiah ignored his struggles. He worked quickly, expertly, using the rope to bind Silas's legs at the ankles, then his wrists behind his back. The knots were simple, functional, and brutally tight. The entire process took less than a minute. With the man bound, Obadiah stood. He looked down at his master, who was now writhing on the ground like a trussed animal, his muffled cries a mixture of fury and pleading. There was no triumph in Obadiah's expression, no satisfaction. There was only a grim, unwavering sense of purpose. He bent down, grabbed the front of Silas's shirt, and began to drag him. The master was not a heavy man, but the dead weight of his panicked, struggling body made it difficult. Obadiah's muscles strained, the tendons in his neck cording with the effort. He dragged him across the mill yard, the rough gravel scraping the skin from Silas's face and hands. He dragged him toward the sound of the river, toward the waiting, open maw of the sluice. He stopped at the edge of the deep, timber-lined channel. Below, the water was a black, silent void. Obadiah hoisted the bound man up, half lifting, half rolling him over the edge and into the channel. Silas landed with a heavy, wet splash in the shallow, stagnant water that had pooled behind the gate. The water was only a few feet deep, but the mud at the bottom was thick and cloying. Silas flailed, trying to find purchase, to sit up, but with his hands and feet bound, he could do little more than thrash helplessly, his face alternately sinking into and emerging from the foul-smelling water. His pleas were now choked with mud and terror. Obadiah watched him for a long, silent moment. He looked at the man who had owned him, who had tormented him, who had destroyed the last physical piece of his mother's memory. He saw not a master, but a pathetic, terrified creature, stripped of all its power, drowning in a foot of water. Then he turned his back on him and walked to the winch. He placed his hands on the heavy wooden handles. He took a deep, steadying breath, the humid night air filling his lungs. He felt the weight of the mechanism, the immense, contained power that he was about to unleash. He looked up at the sky, at the dark, heavy clouds that were now beginning to weep a fine, misty rain. He thought of his mother. He thought of Josiah on the barrel. He thought of the terror in young Samuel's eyes. He thought of Alara. Then, with a single, powerful, and deeply personal act of will, he pulled the iron locking pin free. He threw his entire body into the work, his muscles screaming in protest as he forced the heavy winch to turn. The gate, freed from its lock, began to rise. It moved with a deep, groaning sound, the protest of waterlogged wood being forced against its own immense weight. As it lifted, the first surge of river water began to pour into the channel. Silas saw it coming. He twisted his body, his eyes wide with a final, absolute understanding of his fate. He opened his mouth to scream, but the scream was instantly annihilated. The water did not flow, it detonated. An explosive, solid wall of it erupted into the channel, a liquid battering ram of unimaginable force. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that shook the very ground. It struck Silas and simply erased him, his body vanishing into the churning, brown chaos. There was no struggle. There was no fight. There was only the overwhelming, indifferent violence of the river, unleashed and directed by the hand of a man who had, until this moment, been powerless. Obadiah held onto the winch, his knuckles white, as the full, unrestrained fury of the Oconee roared beneath him. The sound was the voice of his own rage, finally given form and substance. It was the sound of a debt being paid in a currency of terrible, absolute finality. He could not hear the master's screams. He could not hear anything but the water, the deafening, cleansing, and utterly final roar of the water closing over the man who had once owned his life. The roar of the sluice did not simply end, it was guillotined. With a final, shuddering groan, the winch mechanism, no longer held by Obadiah's grip, slipped. The heavy oak gate, driven by its own immense weight, slammed back down into its housing. The sound of its impact, a deep, resonant boom that echoed across the mill yard like a single, final beat of a colossal drum. The violent torrent of water was instantly choked off, its furious voice silenced. In its place, an almost profane quiet descended, a silence so deep and profound that it seemed to have a physical weight. The only sounds that remained were the gentle lapping of the river against its banks, the soft hiss of the intensifying rain, and the slow, heavy drip of water from the timbers of the sluice gate. The act was done. The force had been countered. The world had been irrevocably altered. Obadiah did not move for a long time. He remained standing by the winch, his hands still resting on the smooth, worn wood of the handles. His body was a study in stillness, a stark contrast to the violence he had just unleashed. He was soaked, not from the river, but from the fine, misting rain that had now begun to fall in earnest, plastering his thin cotton shirt to his skin and tracing clean rivulets through the grime on his face. He did not look into the channel where his master had vanished. There was nothing to see. The water there was already beginning to settle, the turbulence subsiding, the surface smoothing over to once again become a dark, placid mirror for the weeping sky. He looked instead at his own hands, turning them over in the faint, ambient light. They were the same hands that had mended tools, that had hauled stones, that had held the small carved bird. They did not look different. They did not feel different. But they had just dismantled the world, slowly, Deliberately, he walked away from the mill. He did not run. His movements were not those of a fugitive fleeing a crime scene. They were the measured, steady steps of a man walking away from a long and arduous task that was finally complete. His expression was a void, a carefully wiped slate that betrayed nothing of the maelstrom of thought and emotion that must have been churning within him. Was there triumph, relief, fear, regret? It was impossible to say. He was a man who had lived his entire life behind a mask of stoic endurance, and now, in the moment of his most profound and transformative act, the mask had become fused with his flesh. He was unreadable, a ghost moving through the rain-slicked darkness. He did not return directly to his cabin. Instead, he walked to the river's edge, a few hundred yards downstream from the mill. He knelt on the wet red clay of the bank and submerged his hands in the cool, dark water. He washed them methodically, scrubbing at the grit under his fingernails, rinsing away the feel of the rope and the winch handle. It was a ritual of cleansing, a quiet personal baptism in the waters of the river that was now both his accomplice and the tomb of his oppressor. He stared out at the current, at the sullen, pewter-gray surface of the Oconee as it moved inexorably toward the sea, carrying its new and terrible secret with it. He remained there for a long time, a solitary, kneeling figure in the rain, until the first pale, sickly light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky. The discovery was made by Phineas, the overseer. He arrived at the mill shortly after sunrise, his mood already foul from the damp, oppressive morning. He found the shattered whiskey bottle near the foundation, a common enough sight, but it was the state of the sluice that caught his attention. There were signs of a struggle in the mud, deep, scuffed tracks that the rain had not yet managed to erase. And there was the rope, a dark, coiled serpent lying in the wet gravel, discarded but not hidden. Phineas was a man of simple, brutal calculations, not of intricate deductions, but even he could read the stark grammar of this scene. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach, that something was terribly wrong. His first thought was not for the master, but for the disruption to the day's work. He bellowed for Silas, his great, booming voice echoing off the silent walls of the mill. The only reply was the mournful cry of a heron from the swamp. Panic, when it came, was a slow contagion. Phineas alerted Theron, who arrived with his usual serpentine quietness. Together, they searched the mill yard, their initial irritation giving way to a growing sense of dread. The master was gone. A search of the great house found his bed unslept in. The alarm was raised. The workday, for the first time in memory, did not begin. The great water wheel remained still, its skeletal form dripping and silent, an exhausted beast of burden that had finally been granted a reprieve. The grinding of the millstones was absent, and the silence it left behind was unnerving, a gaping hole in the fabric of the plantation's reality. Whispers began to move through the slave cabins, quiet and fast as fire in dry grass. The enslaved people went about their morning routines with a carefully maintained facade of normalcy, but their eyes were alive with a furtive, electric energy. They had heard the boom of the sluice gate in the night. They had seen Obadiah return to his cabin, soaked to the bone, his face a thunderous mask, just before dawn. They did not know the details, but they knew that the world had tilted on its axis. A strange, almost giddy sense of fear and hope hung in the air. The sun had risen, but the master's shadow was, for the first time, absent. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. No one looked at Obadiah, yet everyone was aware of him. He sat on the steps of his cabin, calmly mending a leather strap, his movements as precise and unhurried as ever. He was a silent island of calm in the center of a gathering storm. The body was found just before noon. It was discovered by a young boy who had been checking fishing lines a mile downstream. It had snagged on a submerged log near the riverbank, its white shirt a stark, obscene blot against the dark water. The corpse was bloated and discolored, the face rendered unrecognizable by the scraping journey along the riverbed, but the clothes and the expensive leather boots still on his feet were unmistakable. Theron and Phineas supervised the recovery, their faces pale and grim. The master had returned, not as a man, but as a piece of sodden, ruined cargo delivered by the indifferent current. The news of the discovery transformed the plantation's simmering anxiety into open chaos. The overseers, deprived of their source of authority, seemed to shrink, their bluster and menace replaced by a frantic, uncertain energy. They knew that this would not be seen as an accident. The rope, the signs of a struggle, the very nature of the master's demise pointed to a single, unthinkable conclusion: murder. The act was not just the killing of a man, it was an insurrection, a fundamental assault on the natural order of their world. The consequences would be swift and terrible, not just for the perpetrator, but for everyone. Townspeople began to arrive, drawn by the news that spread with unnatural speed. They came on horseback and in buggies, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim outrage. They stood in small, anxious groups, speaking in low, urgent tones, their eyes sweeping over the enslaved community with a new and venomous suspicion. Every black face was now the face of a potential killer. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of impending violence, a collective lust for retribution that was searching for an object. Through it all, Obadiah remained still. He had not moved from his spot on the cabin steps. He watched the white faces of the townspeople, their expressions of shock and anger. He watched the frantic movements of the overseers. He felt the fear that was now radiating from the other slaves, a fear that was beginning to eclipse the fleeting hope of the morning. He had killed one man, but he had summoned a monster with 100 heads. He knew that they would come for him. It was only a matter of time. The question was not whether his act would be seen as murder or justice. In this place, there was no difference. The only question left to answer was whether it would be remembered as a crime or as the beginning of a haunting. The vengeance sought by the community of white faces was a blunt and clumsy instrument. It descended upon the plantation not with the cold precision of an investigation, but with the hot, indiscriminate rage of a mob. Posses were formed, deputizing every man with a horse and a gun. They were fueled by corn whiskey and a righteous terror that one of their own had been struck down by his own property, an act that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their world. Their search for Obadiah began with the slave cabins. They tore through the small, cramped dwellings with a performative fury, overturning meager possessions, ripping open corn-shuck mattresses. Their questions, not questions at all, but accusations spat in the faces of the terrified inhabitants. Alara was subjected to a special kind of cruelty, a vortex of shouted threats and leering insinuations, but her face remained a mask of bewildered grief, a performance so perfect it was indistinguishable from the truth. She knew nothing, she said. She had seen nothing. Obadiah was gone. He had not waited for them to come for him. Sometime during the chaotic hours after the body was discovered, while the overseers were distracted and the townspeople were still gathering, he had simply vanished. He had taken nothing with him. No food, no tools, no blanket. He had slipped out of his life as quietly as he had slipped out of his cabin on his nightly pilgrimages to the river. His absence was a vacuum, and into that vacuum, the mob poured its frustrated rage. They thrashed through the cotton fields, their horses trampling the precious crop. They fired their guns into the dark, impenetrable walls of the cypress swamp, as if they could kill him with noise alone. They sent dogs into the pine forests, but the steady, cleansing rain had washed the ground clean, leaving no scent to follow. The man had dissolved into the landscape, leaving behind nothing but a single perfectly executed act of rebellion and a community trembling in its wake. His fate became the plantation's second great mystery, a story that splintered into a dozen different versions, each told with the absolute certainty of gospel truth. The official account, the one recorded by the county sheriff and accepted by the men who had failed to find him, was that he had been taken by the swamp. They said he had fled into the cypress maze, a place they themselves were unwilling to penetrate too deeply, and had been swallowed by it. They spoke of the thick, black mud that could pull a man down in minutes, of the cottonmouth snakes that hung from the low branches like venomous fruit, of the alligators that lurked just beneath the surface of the still, black water. It was a fitting end, they concluded. The wild man had been reclaimed by the wilderness. He had been judged not by a jury of his peers, but by the unforgiving justice of the land itself. This version was clean, it was simple, and it required no further action. It allowed the terror of the event to be contained, and for the natural order to be, however shakily, restored. A second version, whispered among the overseers and the more fearful of the townspeople, was that he had been taken by the river. They claimed that the Oconee, having served as his weapon, had then claimed him as payment. They imagined him trying to cross the swollen current in the darkness, being swept away just as his master had been, his body pulled down into the murky depths to rot alongside his victim. This story had a pleasing symmetry to it, a sense of divine or infernal retribution. It turned the river into an active agent of justice, a pagan god that would not be used as an instrument of murder without demanding a sacrifice in return. Those who told this version would often cast nervous glances at the river as they passed it, as if its sullen, pewter surface was watching them, waiting. But there was a third version of the story, the one that lived and breathed among the enslaved. It was never spoken aloud in the presence of a white person. It was a story told in whispers after dark, in the brief, stolen moments of privacy between the last chore and the exhaustion of sleep. In this telling, Obadiah was not a victim of the swamp or the river. He was their master. They said he had walked into the cypress swamp, and it had parted for him, its creatures recognizing him as one of their own. They said he had spoken a secret word to the river, and it had carried him away, not to his death, but to a place of freedom in the north, a place that was as much a myth to them as the city of El Dorado. In some tellings, he became a creature of the swamp himself, a tall, silent figure who lived in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the wilderness, a protector of other runaways who would guide them through the treacherous landscape to safety. He became a folk hero, a legend. His name became a prayer for the desperate and a curse upon the masters. He was not the man who had been swallowed by the darkness. He was the man who had become the darkness, a silent, watchful presence in the shadows, a permanent and unsettling reminder that the system was not unbreakable, that a man could, in fact, kill his god and walk away. The plantation did not recover. Silas had no wife and no children, and the property fell to a distant cousin from Savannah who had no interest in agriculture and a deep-seated fear of the humid, violent upcountry. He sold the land, the mill, and the people on it at a loss to a consortium of investors. The new owners tried to restore the place to its former productivity, but a rot had set in, a decay that had nothing to do with the humidity or the price of cotton. The mill, the heart of the plantation, had become a place of profound and unsettling dread. The haunting began subtly. It was not a thing of clanking chains or spectral apparitions. It was a sensory disturbance, a persistent wrongness that clung to the place like the ever-present moss on the oak trees. Workers in the mill would complain of a sudden, intense cold that would descend even on the hottest of summer days, a pocket of air so frigid it would raise the hairs on their arms. Others reported the distinct, unmistakable smell of cheap corn whiskey in the air near the sluice, a scent that would appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The most common report, however, was the sound. On still, moonless nights, when the air was heavy and silent, those who lived near enough to the river would hear it, the faint but unmistakable sound of a glass bottle shattering against the stone foundation of the mill. It was a sound that would jolt them from their sleep and leave them staring into the darkness, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The legend of the drowned master grew with each passing year. It was said that Silas was trapped in the sluice, his spirit bound to the place of his violent, watery death. It was said that if you stood by the channel at dusk and stared into the dark water, you could sometimes see his face, a pale, bloated mask of terror and rage, looking up from the depths. The enslaved people refused to work in the mill after dark, and soon even the white overseers began to find excuses to be elsewhere as the sun began to set. The place was tainted. The constant, grinding groan of the water wheel, which had once been the sound of profit and power, now sounded like a moan of perpetual agony. The mill, Silas's great monument to himself, had become his tombstone. Over the years, the plantation changed hands several times, each new owner buying it for less than the last, each one eventually defeated by the intangible poison that had saturated the soil. The land itself seemed to resent them. Crops failed for no discernible reason. Livestock sickened and died. The great house, neglected, began to surrender to the elements, its white paint peeling, its porches sagging, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a landscape of failure. The legend of Obadiah endured as well, a persistent counter-narrative to the haunting of his master. He became the spirit of the swamp, the ghost of rebellion. It was said that on the anniversary of Silas's death, if you looked across the river toward the dark line of the cypress swamp, you could see a single, tall figure standing at the water's edge, a silent sentinel watching the decaying mill. The story of what he had done was passed down from one generation to the next, a vital piece of oral history. The details shifted and were embellished with time. Obadiah became taller, stronger, his silence a sign of his communion with powerful unseen forces. Silas became more monstrous, a demon who had gotten his just deserts. The story became a parable about justice, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single act of defiance could create its own kind of light. It was a story that said that some things, once broken, could never be repaired, and that some stains could never be washed away, not even by the endless, patient work of the river. The sound of the water flowing through the ruins of the old sluice became the final, enduring voice of the tale, a constant, whispering testament to the night that a slave had drowned his master, and in doing so, had stained the land with a memory that it could never forget. The water of the Oconee still flows over its secrets, and the record on Obadiah is now as complete as the whispers will allow. We are grateful you have stood with us in the shadows of this archive. If you have just discovered this channel, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you are among us when the next file is unsealed, and share your own reflections on this story in the comments below.